for joining us for the third part of our traumatic brain injury series. I'm Zoe Franzone, and I'm here again with Dr. Mary McLaughlin. Our goal is to help homeless service workers, shelter employees, social service personnel, police, and others to recognize behaviors that may be indicative of a traumatic brain injury.
Thank you, Zoe. Our hope is to help those working on the streets to identify a serious disability that often leads to accusations of noncompliance, exclusion from homeless services, arrests, and even premature deaths.
Today we're going to focus on a man named Tom. Dr. Mary met him a few months into her research projects on the street of Central New York State community. Tom had been living on the streets for decades, and we're going to pull up a presentation to share with everyone.
Okay, Tom was a man in his late 40s who had been homeless for many, many years. He was well known to law enforcement personnel because he had been arrested many times. He often appeared to be angry and intoxicated. However, he was receptive to receiving assistance. He had seen that I had been able to help a number of other people in his his social group, and he was wanting me to help those people, and he was helpful to me in helping them. But then, you know, when I was ready to focus on him, he was anxious to receive assistance himself. And I want to make sure to mention that because so often um, people who've been on the streets for years and years are described as service resistant. I didn't find that to be true at all. I found them all. I would more aptly describe them as trauma resistant because they'd been through a system that didn't meet their needs, and they kind of didn't want to go through it again, so they would decline the services that they'd already found to be inadequate. Uh, so,
So, can you tell us something about his background, about what brought him to the streets? I recall that he sustained a head injury in high school.
yes, he had been riding on a bicycle with friends. And Joey, we need slide number 2. Right. He'd been riding on a dirt bike with friends when he was about 14 years old. And, they're all racing along, but he had a vision disorder. He had a very serious vision disorder that he was probably born with. And he ran into an obstacle and was thrown forward wherein he hit his head against a rock. At this point, police were called. He was non responsive. Uh, and the way he tells the story is that, um, police subsequently found that he wasn't answering the questions that they were asking him, and they I guess, were trying to get him to cooperate, and they banged his head into a police cruiser, which, made everything worse. And at that point, he was transported unconscious to a major medical center. The reason the police were asking questions is there had been a suggestion that the dirt bike was stolen. And it wasn't, it was his own dirt bike, but he wasn't responding to questions about this, and you know, police were frustrated with his lack of cooperation, and but he'd already sustained a head injury.
It sounds like he sustained two serious injuries to his head that day, one from the initial injury and then one from the police officer.
Yes, he did. And he was never the same again. He was a student in a very good high school at that point in time, uh, lived in a community which was, a middle class residential community. And, you know, he, he just was never the same again. And people, back then were not well informed about traumatic brain injuries either. There wasn't a whole lot of recognition about how serious it could be to bang your head into something like this, and then, of course, to bang it twice. So given all the frustration with school, he joined the military and signed up for the Marine Corps.
How did that military service go?
Well, he lasted, from what I was able to get him to remember, he lasted for about a year and a half and they discharged him. He was heartbroken about this. And of course, after that length of time, he had completed the basic service. He'd worked hard. But my guess is that he was, you know, given the brain injury and the lack of knowledge about the effects of this, they probably saw him as non-compliant, and they discharged him. And his life on the streets began about that time.
Do you think that his substance use disorder started about that time as well?
That was my impression. Brain injured individuals often have substance use disorders, as we discussed in our previous videos. They also have memory disorders, and it takes a lot of time and patience to help them to recall as much as possible from injuries that are decades old like this. This is why I'm not in favor of using checklist types of inventories. There have been some inventories developed where you're going to spend 10 minutes or so getting somebody to answer questions in a checklist. And I found that doesn't, what my experience was, is when you ask them if they've sustained a head injury, they generally say, no, nothing happened to me. But then given that some of the symptoms are pretty obvious, I would continue to probe and say, well, did you play football? Did you have any kinds of accidents? And then they start to remember, and this is how I was able to get him to focus on this accident. And because, they brought him into a major medical center at that point where he was in a coma for quite some time. It does take time it takes quite a bit of time to sit down and interview these people. And, you can't do it in 5-10 minutes. You need to devote at least an hour to having a careful, patient conversation with people, with any people really, but especially with those who you suspect have sustained a brain injury because of the memory issues.
So are there any other objections that you have to checklist type inventories other than the time issue?
Well, yes, because, there is a field called tests and measurements. And when you start using various tests to assess people, you're supposed to have some information about their reliability and their validity. So, in schools, if they're going to check IQs, for example, they're going to look in a book of tests and they're going to look at how reliable this is, how valid it is. Reliability, of course, is that it's going to measure the same thing each time, and validity, of course, is that they're measuring what they say it's going to measure. It's testing and measurement is, if you're measuring a table with a yardstick, that's pretty simple. You get a 36-inch yardstick, and nobody's going to question that it's a table, and nobody's going to question that it's 36 inches. But when you're measuring something like, say, IQ, which, you can't see or handle or assess physically, and then you're going to assess it with some words, well, the question becomes, is it IQ that you're measuring? And then the next question is this the right instrument to measure it with? So this is why there is so much focus on reliability and validity. But what happens in some of these tests being given by outreach workers to homeless people is there's no reliability data, there's no validity data. It's like these are checklists developed by somebody, but they haven't been confirmed that 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 they are in fact reliable and valid. So I have a lot of objection to these kinds of um, you know tests developed without attention being paid to those two issues.
That's interesting. It's also understandable given that brain injured individuals often have memory disorders, so they probably don't recall everything at the checklist time or right when they're being evaluated by the doctor. But also, hospitals generally don't keep medical records longer than the state requires.
Which in New York is only 7 years. So, with this man, when I tried to get his uh, medical records, they were long gone. I wasn't, and he was a patient in a major medical center, but, I think they told me they kept the records as long as 10 years, which was longer than required by law. But, with people who've been injured long ago, it's hard to confirm what happened because the records don't exist anymore. So you have to start all over again, bring them to a neurologist, and get them evaluated again. And of course, the neurologists often raise this objection, which we discussed before. After about 2 years after a traumatic brain injury, there's not a whole lot of improvement that will be expected. So they're reluctant to do a lot of expensive testing when it's not going to make much difference anyway, because there isn't much we can do at this point. So I often tell them, well, we need this because I want him to be declared disabled, because I might be able to get him into housing as a disabled individual and also into a disability program like the Medicaid, the New York State Medicaid Traumatic Brain Injury Program. So moving on from this, of course they need health insurance. Now, we're getting a little off track here, but what happened with him was, so I brought him to a neurologist. We had all kinds of testing done, including an MRI, and I met personally with the radiologist who showed me the MRI of his brain and showed me exactly where there was damage, significant damage to his brain. So with that, I continued my advocacy at social services and managed to persuade them to put him into a motel. And because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, people with a bona fide disability are entitled to what's called a minimal accommodation. In other words, they don't have to meet the strict requirements that everybody else does if they have a disability. You can waive some things. And of course, at this point, I was only working with people who were at high risk of death. So this was a big concern. There's only one of me, and I wasn't able. Everything I do is very time intensive. So I was focusing on the people at highest risk of death in the community. And he, of course, was one of them. So, I didn't want him to be found dead on the street while we're trying to straighten things out. So I did, social services did put him into a motel. Um, it's a hard story to tell because things didn't really go that well. Um, at this point, I had gotten a number of people housed, and they were pretty unhappy to see me down at social services. I was starting to learn that all the rhetoric about we really care and all of this, I wasn't seeing that playing out. What I was seeing was a lot of resentment of my bringing these cases of, severely disabled individuals who were at high risk of death in for help. But I mean, so at this, by the time I brought him in, and of course, he had a reputation for being difficult and at times violent, and he was well known to the police, and social services people weren't happy to see him, and it kind of got really ugly down at social services, and so we've got him in a motel, but I want to get him into regular housing, and I could see that people weren't happy with what I was doing, and of course, this upset me a lot because this man was basically a veteran of the Marine Corps. I mean, he I'm confident had been discharged because he probably couldn't comply with all the requirements, and they probably thought he was, non-compliant. I didn't ever see what the cause of his discharge was, but it was not whatever the first class discharge, favorable. So he had 3 pending court cases, and I noticed there was some reluctance to continue services to him. And I kind of thought, well, they're just waiting because he has 3 court cases pending, and the likelihood that he'll go back to jail is pretty significant. So they probably not going to bother doing anything and just wait and see what happens. And basically, I didn't see how he could survive 3 court cases either. But sure enough, we did. The first one, I went to court and represented him. It wasn't a felony case. And I remember we walked out, and I said, I cannot believe we're walking out of here. But then again, I have access to a lot of legal help. People in the legal community give me a lot of help, and they had told me how to represent him. But the next 2 cases were some kind of, he was entitled to the services of a free lawyer. They must have been felonies that he was entitled to the services of a free lawyer. I can't remember what they were. I mean, felony strikes me as like something pretty awful, and none of these cases were that awful, but he was entitled to the services of a defense attorney. So in those 2 cases, I went and met with the defense attorney and, told him what was going on and what my recommendations were, and would he bring a letter from me to the judge about what I, thought was a good program to follow for him. Well, lo and behold, in all of these cases, the judge accepted my recommendations. And I found this in other cases that they accepted my recommendations. And that happened most of the time, almost all of the time. And I started to see, my impression was the judges were tired of seeing these disabled people coming into court repeatedly. I mean, some of my people have been incarcerated, one of them 16 times. I read about a woman in Los Angeles in the Skid Row area who's been arrested 59 times. So, my impression was that if you could provide a better option, the judges were interested in that. So at this point in time, we survived all 3 court cases, and I wanted him into permanent housing. And at this point, I also was sending all the medical information that I was gaining to an office in New York which provides services to people with brain injuries. It's called the New York State Medicaid Traumatic Brain Injury Program. So I was able to get him into that program. And that's an especially nice program because it pays for market rate housing. You don't have to go and get the cheapest, awfulest apartment in a terrible area. You can get whatever's standard for the area, market rate housing, which is pretty nice. And so he was eligible for that. But by the time he was cleared for the program, he had survived the 3 court cases, and I wanted him into real housing. There had been some things that went on at the motel where uh, he was temporarily housed, and they were asking him to do things. Um, and in one case, they asked him to clean up the room of a person who had died, and I really felt that, and there was apparently bodily fluids and blood, and I really felt that
Oh, wow.
they should have hired a service. There are services to clean up death sites, and they were asking him to do things like that. So I really wanted him out of there and into his own place, and I, managed to get somebody in the housing services to get him an apartment. But this guy, at that point, lost all patience with me and just refused to answer any calls, texts, or emails from me for the next couple of years, as I recall. He wouldn't answer anything. And, he went out on one time and he got him an apartment, and early in the morning, and I got a text from, this man, Tom, and that he had an apartment. And from that moment on, I was just persona non grata, absolutely. But nevertheless, we've got him into housing, and he's into the Medicaid traumatic brain injury program, and he has a case manager. Well, this is almost always a stumbling block, because all of the people who had been working with him this far had graduate school degrees. By this point, I had him into counseling with a social worker who had a master's degree in counseling, and I had him into substance use counseling with another agency where the person working with him had a master's degree in social work. And they were very interested in learning from me how his disability played out and how they could be most helpful. And he was doing extremely well with both of those counseling programs. However, this brain injury program was paying his rent, and he had a case manager there who was just empowered to just ignore all of us. I mean, here I had a PhD degree in rehabilitation psychology. There are 2 master's degree level social workers working with him. And, this man just had this, one thing that happens with substance use counseling is you can run into somebody who thinks, well, whatever happens, the person's in denial. Whatever you do, you're enabling. I mean, none of this takes into account the fact that the person might have a traumatic brain injury, a psychiatric disorder, which this man also had. He also had a serious vision disorder, and he also had various orthopedic problems from living outdoors. And this guy turned out to be just a real problem. And, he's threatening Tom about if you don't do this and if you don't do that, you'll lose your housing. And so this is making Tom more and more nervous because he loves his little apartment. So it went on like this, and we encountered an incident where, in this Medicaid program, you're supposed to take some classes. But when I saw the list of classes, I mean, this was obvious this man wasn't going to be going into any job or any occupation. And he was pretty much overwhelmed with everything that was happening to him, coming in off the street after spending decades there and trying to comply with the social services requirements, trying to comply with the requirements of the counseling programs. There were 2 of them, and he liked those. But he had to take some kind of class. So, we finally, Tom and I settled on a cooking class. And, it was really kind of preposterous because he had been a short order cook in a restaurant. So, he certainly could cook for himself. But when we went over the list of things, he was required to sign up for something, and that's what he decided to sign up for. So everything's going well, and he has his substance use counseling meeting on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, and I think his other counseling meeting was Monday at 11 o'clock. And, with people with a psychiatric disorder, which he also had, they basically become very rattled under two conditions. One is too fast a pace, and another one is too many people. And you just, it's kind of like if you get them a job at McDonald's, they're not going to last until noon. It's just everything is going too fast. There are too many people. Well, this poor man has not only the psychiatric disability, but all of these other issues. And he got a call one morning at about 8 in the morning, and it was the cooking teacher. And she said she was coming to give him a cooking lesson at 9 o'clock. Well, he said that he had his substance use appointment at 11, and he basically, on that day, didn't like to schedule anything else, especially, at the last minute, which she had just called him that morning. But, she insisted, no, you have to do this, you're required, and I have time now, and I'm coming right out. And so with that, I notified his case manager and said, he really needs not to have these appointments on Monday or Wednesday before his most important meetings of the week with his two therapists. And can this be done at another time? No, it cannot. No, he's required to do this. He has to do that. And no matter what I told him, he just didn't want to hear it. And this is one of the things that I have found in all of my work with chronically homeless, disabled people is I have repeatedly seen these kinds of people, case managers, completely ignore recommendations from doctors, psychologists, social workers. They just ignore it and do whatever they want. And what it does is it causes terrible problems. This man had absolutely no training at the level that all of the medical and healthcare professionals working with Tom had. So this went on for a couple of weeks where she would call up at the last minute, either Monday or Wednesday morning, and insist upon coming over at 9 a.m. to give him a cooking lesson. And and then of course she'd stay until he had a race to get to the appointment. And he was becoming more and more rattled. He was just coming apart over this, and he just told me he just couldn't do it, and I knew he couldn't. And I contacted his other two therapists, and they agreed that on those days that he just wasn't himself, and it was that he really couldn't do this. And I said, well, I can't get his case manager to back off. And I was emailing him repeatedly about this. So I said, what I'd like to do is have the three of us send an email to this man. And so we did. The three of us, I think, sent a couple of emails saying, he can't do this. It's like asking somebody who can't walk to stand up and walk. He just cannot do it. And, the same answer, well, that's when this woman is available, and that's when she wants to do it. And the cooking teacher was like about 22 years old. She was just a young person, and I thought very full of herself. She wasn't willing to be flexible about when she was going to do this. So it went on like this, and we've been sending emails to him, the three of us, and Tom is becoming more and more desperate and disintegrating right before the eyes of all three of us professionals working with him. And I was in my office one day, and it was a gorgeous day in the middle of summer, and I got a call about 2 p.m. And it was somebody else who lived in another apartment in Tom's building. And he said, Dr. Mary, he said, you better come right now. Ted's dead. And I just couldn't, I was just stunned. You could have knocked me over with a feather and outraged. And, I got in my car and raced over there. And by this time, they had removed his body from his apartment, but the coroner was still there. And I spoke with the coroner for a while, and, I asked him one of my concerns was that he had been murdered because, once a homeless person gets an apartment, a lot of his friends from the street want to come and stay there, and they put a lot of pressure on the apartment, the person renting the apartment, to stay there. But the rules are, again, we're up against the rules here. The rules are that if you let these people in, you're going to lose your apartment. So it's like you're confronting these rules all the time. They're just endless rules. But my concern was that this might have happened, that he might have declined to let somebody in and the person might have assaulted him. But the coroner told me, well, as far as he could tell, there was no evidence of assault or a homicide, that he wasn't sure what had happened to him, but he did say the time of death was about 12 hours earlier. It was in the middle of the night sometime, and he had been found near his bed on the floor. So he might have gotten up for something, but he was found on the floor. And of course, he'd been there for at least 12 hours or so before anybody, a neighbor came looking for her cat, and the cat often came over to Tom's apartment, and that's how he was discovered. And so the coroner said to me, I think you should go in and talk to the people at the morgue. They have a death investigator there. So I went in and I told them all of what I knew about the circumstances that preceded his death. And he was autopsied the next morning, and, there was an autopsy report prepared, which subsequently I did obtain. And I also had a couple of lengthy conversations with the pathologist because, the pathologist, if somebody's found dead in the street, he was going to be performing autopsies on them. And, after performing an autopsy, it was clear to him that the individual was disabled, probably in many ways, So he was very cooperative in discussing this at length with me. And of course, they did find the brain trauma in his brain. So I guess, I wanted to tell this story because this kind of situation happened to me a number of times, where I would get medical care for somebody. And in one case, I had somebody in a hospital for months. And we made very careful plans with the discharge social worker about where he should go when he got out. And, we were told they didn't want him going to a shelter because, like I said earlier, shelters have too many people, too fast a pace, too many rules, too much this, and this really causes people with serious psychiatric disorders to decompensate. It makes them worse, and the next thing you know, they're being kicked out for non-compliance. So, it was very important that he be not sent to a shelter. And the social worker at the hospital had literally gone to a number of follow-up places, transitional housing kinds of places where treatment could be continued. And And what do you think happened? An outreach worker came and took him came to pick him up at the hospital after months of work with a psychiatrist and social workers at this hospital, and took him directly to a shelter. He was back on the street within 24 hours after all this medical treatment we had obtained for him at a major medical center. They just blew it all off. And I think it's important for people to know this, because what we have is a situation when we see people on the street and they are being described as service resistant, non-compliant. There's a whole string of adjectives, but that has not been my experience at all. So, this is what happened here, and the story's even worse than what I'm telling you now, but I'm trying to make this as short as possible. It was infinitely worse even than I'm telling you now. So this is what happened with him, and it's another case in which I felt that if he had received competent case, I literally can't stand the term case manager. First of all, it overly authorizes, in many cases, massively unqualified people to work with, individuals like this with complex disabilities. And they get it empowers them to, in some cases, be really unpleasant and hostile and self-righteous, and just to ignore medical recommendations. I've even seen them ignore the recommendations of a parole officer that I was working with. They just, and the parole officer was really angry about it, because he said, I'm paying for his treatment there, and I told him not to discharge this man without talking with me. And sure enough, they went and discharged him anyway. It's a big reason why you see so many of these people out in the street, and then you see what those of us in the disability field, the professionals in the field, call blaming the victims. And there's a great deal of this, and I'm hoping, that we can raise people's awareness about this, that the level of services being offered is inadequate to the level of disability that's out there. I've seen a few people who were interested in, learning from the social workers and learning from me, and, upgrading their skills by learning more about disabilities. But that was more the exception than the rule. It's more about, this is the rule. I can even recall when I first brought him to social services, and the intake worker said, "You go to mental health." And I said to her at the time, I said, well, I'm wondering if he might be able to go to a neurologist instead, because, I've been able to observe his behavior for a while, and it looks to me like he has a brain injury. And she looked at me and she said, pointed her finger again at him, and she said, "You go to mental health." Wasn't even willing to listen at all, And of course, he ended up dead. And his autopsy and his MRI all corroborated the brain injury. So this is a large part of what we're dealing with, and this is a large part of why the death rate for this population is 30 years younger than housed people. He was 49 when he died. An average person dies 30 years older than that. Given the situation I described in this video, one thing I know is there are a lot of regular people out there wanting to help this population, and they do a lot of nice things like donate meals and sleeping bags and tents and so forth. But basically, these things all serve to maintain homelessness. These are not housing. But there is a big population out there of people who want to help, and I know you and I have discussed what I want to do is to help people to be more helpful, and I can train them in some of the skills that I use in working with this population. And I just recorded how do you talk with somebody like this? How do you start and establish a relationship? How do you get this information from them? So I just a week or two ago recorded the first podcast on this topic. It's called Basic Counseling Skills, and it covers listening skills, and that's available on the website. If you go to the social media page on the website and then scroll down to Anchor.
We invite viewers to watch the first two videos in our TBI series. They're available on YouTube, and we hope this information has been helpful. We also have a website, drmarymclaughlin.com, which contains additional information about homelessness advocacy and other related topics.
All right, thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.